Good morning, folks. Welcome to the kickoff of our webinar series on building equitable economies. Today, we're doing a piece called Moving California Forward, and we are California Forward, so that's where that comes from. And we're going to tell you a little bit about the partners that we work with in our work on building a more equitable economy in the state. Ezra Klein had a terrific piece in today's New York Times, really asking the question that so many of us ask, which is, if California, in fact, has these progressive values, if California, as we do, has very high levels of taxation, high levels of regulation, high levels of spending, what are we getting for that? Are we actually delivering on equity? And to the extent that we're not, by having the highest rate of real poverty in the nation, by having much higher racial inequities than a lot of other states, what do we need to do to get different outcomes? How do we build those more equitable economies? So to talk to you about how California Forward does that, I have three of my amazing colleagues here, and you're going to hear from each of them. Jennifer Levitt, our Associate Director of Public Policy, Patrick Atwater, our Senior Research Analyst, and Ish Herrera, coming to you live from West Fresno County, our Director of Regional Stewardship. We're all over the place, LA, the Inland Empire, Fresno, because you've got to be all over the place in order to really work on this amazing state of ours. So with no further ado, next slide, please, Lauren. So, housekeeping, this meeting is being recorded. Please use the Q&A feature, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen, to ask us questions. We'll get through this presentation piece in about half an hour and then have a lot of time for Q&A. Also, feel free to participate in the chat, but we'll be monitoring the Q&A for questions. Please do keep your microphones muted. And next slide, Lauren. All right, so these are the fun folks that you'll be hearing from today. And I'll introduce each of them when we get to their places. Next slide. All right, so we're, well, a little different, right? Most nonprofits and groups like ours have a narrow focus, and that's fine. You know, they advocate for labor, or they advocate for the environment, or they advocate for business. And we really bring all of those different groups together to make progress for the state. We lead a statewide movement to create an economy and a government that works for everyone. And our partners in that, in particular, are the members of the California Stewardship Network. So we're a statewide organization, but there are lots of organizations that we partner with regularly that are a part of our work, that have created the Economic Summit with us from the outset, that are really focused on particular regions, either very large regions like Los Angeles, very small regions. There are many differences across the regions, but there are also many similarities. Wonderful groups like the Inland Empire Economic Partnership, the Sierra Business Council, the Central Valley Community Foundation, the Inland Empire Community Foundation, all work together to create a better state for all of our regions. And we do this work through the California Economic Summit. And our 10th California Economic Summit is coming up this year, where we figure out, how do we have housing policies that don't just make sense for one part of the region, one part of the state, that don't just make sense in downtown San Francisco, but also make sense in Northern California? How do we make sure that we have policies that mitigate wildfire? And you'll be hearing a lot more about that later in the webinar. And then finally, we have the California Dream Index, which is really the evidentiary basis for our work. But next slide, Lauren. But these are not sort of separate, disconnected things. They all come together in what we like to call the, what I like to call, maybe my colleagues think I'm a little crazy for this, the circle of life, right? And if you're imagining Rafiki lifting up baby Simba well, with that music playing, that's exactly what we're attempting to invoke in your minds here. But the point is that we really aren't going to get to better equitable outcomes through having a disconnected set of approaches. We really need to have an ecosystem of equity. And that's what we do with our very many partners in the California Stewardship Network, our many partners in the California Economic Summit, and grounding ourselves in evidence. So that's where we start. We have to be honest. We have to start with the facts of the matter. And the facts of the matter are that we don't have good broadband access for everyone. The facts of the matter are we do have very high rates of poverty. So we start out with this evidence in the California Dream Index, and Patrick's going to tell you a little bit more about that in just a little bit. But then we take the conversation to the communities. We don't want to, and we have utterly failed the people of our state through trying to work this out through interest group politics in Sacramento. There just isn't a path forward there. We need to reground ourselves in the experience of the people who are struggling or doing well, living in the regions, and coming together to figure out what the priorities of those regional communities are, and then elevate that into better approaches to a broad range of policies that happens through the California Economic Summit. And then sometimes California Forward is going to be the group that it makes sense to carry that forward. We have a 501c4 called the California Forward Action Fund. We sponsor bills. We take positions on pieces of legislation. We work on efforts in the regions. And then hopefully we move the dial. And we see that showing up in the California Dream Index. So that's really this ecosystem of equity. That's our approach, a different approach to try to get substantially better outcomes for Californians. Over the course of the coming weeks, we're going to be diving into a number of different areas. Next week, criminal justice reform. We're going to be having housing, home ownership, so many really terrific topics and so many amazing partners. So we do hope that you'll join us for this series. It's going to be every Thursday morning at 11 a.m. And bring your friends, bring your family, bring your dogs, whoever it is that you want to get in on the Zoom. And we'd really love to see you and others participating in this weekly series going forward. All right, next slide. Okay, so let's start by grounding ourselves in the evidence. So in order to do that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Patrick Atwater, who's going to tell you about the very exciting California Dream Index that we launched at last year's California Economic Summit. Patrick, take it away.
Thank you, Micah. So what do we mean by the California Dream? California is somewhat unique among the 50 states in identifying itself with the dream of a better life. We're looking very nuts and bolts at economic mobility and the chance of one generation of doing better than the next. So if you were born in California in 1940, you had over a 90% chance of out earning your parents. If you were born in 1980, the most recent decade for which data is available, there's a little less than a coin flip. So these are long-term, structural trends that we're seeing, challenges and need to improve. So when we look at the California Dream Index, we're looking at 10 factors and 10 indicators that are correlated empirically with long-term economic mobility, and also things that we really work on at California Forward and levers that we can make progress through statewide policy. Some of these types of indices can get pretty wonky, though it's very grounded in terms of can you afford a home? Is the rent too high? Do jobs pay enough to meet the real cost of living? Is the air where you live good to breathe and the water clean to drink? Can you get access to broadband internet? How long are typical commutes in your area? And all of these data are broken down across, we work across regions across the state, as well as broken down by race and ethnicity, so that we really ground that into the work that we do with the California Dream Index rather than as another layer on top of it. So if you can go to the next slide, Lauren. And this is particularly a moment because, we are in the midst of a bit of a plague year, and the COVID-19 crisis has been very much an inequality bomb, as Micah often wisely says. The labor market outcomes in California are very, very different at different levels of the income spectrum. We're actually seeing, job growth among high-wage jobs, and we're seeing some pretty dramatic, cuts in lower-wage jobs. And that's, pretty intuitive if you think about it in terms of, a lot of the lockdown restrictions that have had big impacts for restaurants, other service industries. And, when you look at the impact of this is particularly acute when you think about that the impact of COVID has been particularly felt by people that were already affected by things like on the cost side of the equation, on like housing costs. Communities that were particularly affected by overcrowding, that's a big reason that we're seeing higher incidence of COVID, particularly among Latino communities in poorer parts of California. If you go to the next slide, Lauren. It's really important to note that because these trends are not new. Lauren, if you could please go to the next slide. We'll see like these housing crisis has been building for a long time. So here you can see the different home ownership percentages across California's some of the major racial demographics, and along with the change over the last decade. And for the state as a whole, home ownership has declined around 4.5%, which is pretty incredible when you think about we just had a very dramatic boom in a lot of ways. The state's economy went from the world's 9th to the 5th largest, and pretty much all Californians, Black, Latino, white, saw decreased home ownership percentages. One thing to really note is that Black Californians, for example, have seen lower home ownership rates today than they did in the 60s when there were very explicitly racist housing policies on the books. And if you look kind of more broadly and look at, say, for like younger Californians ages 18 to 34, the home ownership rates there have really collapsed, falling in half since 1980. And that's just looking at younger Californians who are living on their own. When you look more broadly, there's also been a doubling of the number of younger Californians that live at home. And those are predominantly Californians of color. So that's kind of one of the, both looking at like the near-term impact of COVID, along with one of our key indicators within the DREAM Index. If you go to the next slide, Lauren, you can see the link to the tool itself, where you can, at your leisure, we invite you to go to the website, explore, play around with the data. There's also links to like the documentation. You can get in touch. There's a contact form if you have any questions. You can see how these data are broken down by region and race. And if you go to the next slide, Lauren, one thing we really want to flag though is that these 10 indicators and the tool is just part of what the larger California DREAM Index initiative, where we see this very much as there's a lot of these indices out there, and this is really see it as a starting point where we want to build a community that's really committed to using the data and the evidence so that we can move the needle on California has a lot of great progressive goals, so that we can be really clear-eyed about where we are falling short of those goals and how we can make progress on them. So building a community of practice that is committed to that initiative and using data and evidence to move that needle. So with that, you'll hear more from Ish and Jennifer about how the community of practice infuses our work across the issues in our work groups through the Economic Summit and our regions in the California Stewardship Network. So back over to you, Micah.
All right, thank you so much, Patrick. Now time to move around the circle to the next stop in our ecosystem of equity, and that is with Ish Herrera, our Director of Regional Stewardship, who's been leading the California Stewardship Network, who's been working with the Newsom administration on Regions Rise Together, and he's going to tell you more about how we really ground ourselves in regional and community priorities.
Great. Thank you, Micah, and good morning to all. Let me just start off by saying that I'm not as grumpy as that picture suggests. I'm a lot more cheery fellow than that. You know, the regional priorities and our regional partners are really at the heart of what we do as an organization and provide the important input that guides much of the work that Patrick described, and most, if not all, of the work that Jennifer will overview for us in a few minutes. I just want to give you a quick update on where we're at with our California Stewardship Network. This is a coalition, a network of organizations across the state. You can see that our membership has grown in the last 12 months to include some of the geographies that we're lacking, we're not being represented in our network. We are continuing to add new organizations. Community foundations, surprisingly, have been some of the folks that we've added in recent months. Many community foundations are stepping into this role of convening stakeholders across their regions, specifically on issues of equity and inclusivity with regards to economic development. So we've welcomed them to the table along with others. But this is a network of organizations whose really commitment is first and foremost to be civic stewards in their respective regions, their specific areas of California. And they also have demonstrated through their body of work, through their leadership in the region, a commitment to triple bottom line solutions. Triple bottom line meaning equal importance to the economy of the region, the natural environment of the region, and making sure that all residents in the region can benefit and share from the prosperity that is developed economically and socially. So those 3 E's are really key. You'll see here that one of the things that we are attempting to do at the end of every calendar year is gauge among our membership what their priorities ought to be for the coming year. And this is an exercise we conducted fall of last year, and it didn't shift much from 2020 as a result of the pandemic and a lot of the issues that continue to be very much front and center with the realities of the world right now. And the 4 that you see there are things that are going to be very much visible in Jennifer's presentation, and that isn't by accident. The way that California Forward decides to choose its priorities as an organization is very much informed by the priorities that we hear from and that are reported to us from our regional partners that are part of the California Stewardship Network. So if you're listening today, you're not a member of the network, I invite you to consider reaching out to me and learning more about what it means to be part of this growing network of organizations. Next slide, please. And so quickly, I'll just share why a regional approach is important. You know, what we know is that regions aren't confined to geopolitical boundaries of counties or city limits. They transcend those political lines on maps, and really, you know, can be as large as multiple counties and multiple subregions of California. You know, with the Northern California mega region being just one example of that. But we know that regions are also regional approaches is important because of the interconnectivity, the interdependence that exists not just within the region but across regions. That things like the watersheds of the state, the forests, the commute patterns of our workforce are all things that affect all regions, and what happens in one affects what happens in another. So that interdependency is front and center with why, as an organization, you know, we choose the regional level of our work. Next slide, please. One of the ways that we leaned even further into regional efforts is through a partnership that we started, began with the Newsom administration back in 2019. Some of you who may be on the call here today may recall the Regions Rise Together convenings that we co-hosted with a couple of the agencies at the state level and different parts of the state. We were mostly focused on the inland parts of California, as it being one of the priorities of the new gubernatorial administration when it launched. And those efforts have actually led to continuing interest and appetite from regional stakeholders to do even deeper dives beyond one-day convenings, and have, in some examples, we've been part of in supporting the deployment of regional initiatives that are looking to create plans and implement those plans with the focus on socioeconomic advancement for all residents, and in a way that's inclusive of non-traditional stakeholders, and in a way that places racial ethnic equity front and center in the recipe of these plans. And so some examples of that are currently are in the Salinas Valley, in Kern County. Efforts are still ongoing in the San Joaquin, northern parts of the San Joaquin Valley. There's other examples such as the Fresno Drive initiative, efforts that are continuing in the San Diego region, in the Sacramento. The southern part of the Central Coast has begun an effort as well. So this shift towards doing economic development with these other two important pieces, really being salient in the approach it's spreading to many regions, and it's gained a lot of attention from not just our network members, but other organizations who are present in those regions. So definitely more to come on that front. Next slide, please. And so, some of the goals that we have with these regional initiatives that align with the Regions Rise Together effort is really, first and foremost, changing the way that we all think about not just our own region, trying to think of it from an asset-minded perspective, but thinking about other regions, our neighbors to our north, south, east, west, and seeing the assets in their backyards. That every region, every county of California has something to offer and is integral to the mosaic that is California, and that what happens in one impacts another, and that that it's not zero sum. The success of one is the success of us all. And so changing that mental map is a big piece of what we're trying to achieve here with our efforts. But we're also trying to remind folks and really hone in on enhancing the interconnectivity that makes us all one. Mention things like broadband, that's become very front and center during the pandemic, with, folks having to balance that with housing opportunities, with workforce opportunities. On the environmental side, we talked about watersheds and forest management and wildfires. So that interconnectivity, interdependence is part of this as well. And then we one thing I want to mention is that we also continue to advocate for this approach to be more formally adopted and codified within state government, so that it becomes more accessible to a vast number of regions and partners across the state. And it's aligned very well with the goals of the administration here in California with regards to this desire to have what is called high road economic development, and then working with supporting regions who are maybe experiencing the need to justly transition from traditional economic conditions to more sustainable ways of building their economy. So the alignment there continues to be strong. Next slide, please. Two other things I want to quickly just mention, and this is more of a homework assignment for you all that are listening, is to keep your eyes and ears open for the young talent in your regions. And by young talent, I mean folks that are in high school, that are doing their undergraduate studies, but also folks who have started their professional careers, or even mid-career. We've launched a program that starts with that earlier age range, which we have showcased in the last two summits, called the Young Leaders Advisory Council. We're looking for talented individuals all across the state, urban, rural, north, south, to become part of this group. And this isn't just a group that we created for novelty's sake. These young individuals are providing meaningful contributions to the policy discussions and recommendations that are leading our work as an organization. So we put them to work, and we put them to they're contributing meaningfully. So we welcome you to forward us any recommendations you may have. And I want to just give a special shout out to our colleagues, David and Navid and Amber, who are leading this effort, who will be your points of contact there. And then lastly, if we can go to the final slide, we hope that these young leaders will eventually transition into this program, which is the Becky Morgan, the recently renamed Becky Morgan Steward Leadership Program. And this is a program that is currently running its third cohort through the curriculum. This is a program that identifies individuals who may be in their 20s, maybe in their 30s, maybe in their 40s, even their 50s and beyond, but individuals who want to become more involved in their region and the organization they work for, and taking on leadership roles that are centered on providing, identifying, and analyzing, and creating solutions through the triple bottom line lens, and really stepping into civic leadership roles within their respective regions and communities. And so this is a program that I had the pleasure of leading with two of our regional partners. And so I would be your best contact if there's individuals from your organization or organizations, other organizations within your region that you think there'd be good candidates for. You can send them my way, and there's my contact info will come up at the end of the slide. But we're always looking for individuals to participate in this program. Cohort 4, the recruitment period for that will begin in the early summer, so more to come on that as well. And with that, I will turn it over back to our CEO, Micah Weinberg.
All right, thank you so much, Ish. As I'm turning it over to Jennifer Lovett here, if you have questions for us, please drop them into the questions box on the right side of your screen. So next slide, Lauren. Now Jennifer Lovett is going to, our Associate Director of Public Policy, talk about, okay, so we've got this grounding in evidence, we've understood what the regional priorities are, how do we actually do anything about it? How do we change our actual policies? So if you could ask some questions during Jennifer's chat, we'll jump into the Q&A afterwards, but let me turn it over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Micah. Hello, everyone. I will jump right in here. Before we get into the specific priorities from the roadmap for this year, just a quick recap of how this process works. The priority actions for a given year are directly informed by the activities of the California Economic Summit and associated policy work groups, which are in turn informed by a Summit Planning Advisory Committee, our Leadership Council, our regional partners, and the California Dream Index. The work groups are the primary vehicle through which California Forward advances its policy work, focused around specific action areas that we consider critical to driving shared prosperity and economic mobility for Californians. Our 2020 set of work groups, which informed this year's priority actions, are listed here below. Next slide, please. In terms of timing, we put together this graphic to illustrate how we move this work forward year-round. So we're here in this first quadrant, launch, roadmap, and connect to state policy. And where applicable, I'll detail where we're exploring specific pieces of legislation through our action fund. But really, this is the time where we're following up on all the feedback from Economic Summit participants and determining the best way to advance this year's priority actions. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to jump into our priority actions for 2021. You'll notice at the top of the slide here, the Housing for All title. I've grouped these priorities by what we refer to as our action areas. These are the overarching categories for the policy areas that California Forward is dedicated to advancing. As I'm going through, I'll reference specific work groups that generated the priority actions listed here. Our priority actions for housing in 2021 were informed by our expanding home ownership and increasing community investment work groups. Access to safe, affordable housing is essential and something that is increasingly out of reach in all regions of the state and even to moderate income Californians. This first priority action is centered around helping the state and localities effectively plan for increased housing production targets by issuing data-driven recommendations and reports, including a forthcoming housing affordability assessment by region, which we'll get into on our February 25th webinar, and another focus on affordable home ownership by communities of color. The goal here is primarily agenda setting to keep the focus on making it easier to build and to increase the overall supply of the housing that we need, while ensuring homeownership and not just affordable rental housing is a key part of the state's housing agenda, and that the unique needs of our different regions are also being addressed. Also, in line with increasing housing production, we're supporting statutory change to advance the redevelopment of commercial properties in the state to allow for mixed use and residential purposes. The pandemic is accelerating trends that are shifting a lot of commercial activity online, and there's a significant amount of commercially zoned land that is well situated for housing development. Building on efforts from last year, we're working on legislation that would give authority to enhance infrastructure financing districts, which is another signature California Forward initiative, to help unwind one of the major sticking points in the revitalization of these commercial properties, which is parking agreements with major anchor retailers. Next slide, please. Moving on to our Equitable Communities Action Area, these priorities were all informed by our Planning Regional Inclusive Economies work group. And what do we mean when we say inclusive regional economies? So Ish, Micah, and Patrick have all touched on this, but just to drive it home, California is a big, diverse place and is home to significant racial and geographic inequalities. This action area is meant to address the chronic symptoms of these inequities that are reflected in policies that maintain the status quo and create barriers to opportunity. So by including this as an action area and a policy priority, we're saying that we must be deliberate about changing the power and economic imbalances in society by bringing everyone to the table and then following through when they tell us what's needed to create an economy where everyone can participate and thrive. For the past couple of years, we've been advancing this priority through participation in on-the-ground regional planning processes already underway in regions throughout the state, including those in Fresno and Salinas, and supporting a state program, or grant program and framework that supports these processes as well. And that piece of legislation, AB 106, is being carried by Assemblymember Rudy Salas, and we're currently working on building a coalition of support to ensure it moves forward this year. Next slide, please. Next, we have our Ecosystems and Climate Resiliency Action Area, the environment portion of our triple bottom line philosophy. So everyone up and down the state has witnessed the destructive wildfires of the past few years. The good news is that despite a changing climate and everything that goes along with that, there are things that we can do to address this. And this action area details where we're focusing our efforts through our Empowering Resilient and Productive Landscapes work group. We have 3 priority actions for 2021 here, including supporting the immediate scaling of state investment in wildfire reduction and forest restoration. We're also maintaining a focus on longer-term solutions, which include fostering an innovative wood products industry in the state that can help with forest and fuel management while supporting rural economies. And this final priority action is centered on identifying high potential on-the-ground projects that support all of these policy goals I've just detailed, and to elevate these projects, especially those with the potential to scale, in later dates of this webinar series. So stay tuned for that. Next slide, please. Moving on to our Thriving Economies action area, which encompasses our advancing manufacturing and investing in small businesses owned by people of color work groups. This action area is focused on supporting regional economic and business activity in a way that supports individuals employed by those businesses and our larger goal of building equitable economies. Starting with our small business group, as we all know, small businesses have really taken a hit this past year, and small businesses owned by people of color were already facing significant barriers like capital access that were holding back the true potential of this segment of the economy. This work group, which was led by the Office of the Small Business Advocate housed within the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, led a series of meetings in the second half of last year that resulted in a framework of recommendations to support POC-owned small businesses through transforming capital access programs, scaling affordable lending systems, and exploring debt alternatives for startups. This priority is all about advancing the work this group has done in terms of forming recommendations that can help target support and implement systems change. Next slide, please. Our Advancing Manufacturing group focuses on creating conditions for a thriving, sustainable manufacturing industry in the state, which includes building a pipeline of skilled workers. This group initially issued a set of recommendations coming out of the 2019 summit centered around 4 priority issues of strategy, workforce, infrastructure, and trade, with a particular focus on establishing a state sustainable manufacturing council within, again, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development to represent the voices of California manufacturers. Over the past year, the group updated these recommendations based on the impact of COVID-19, wildfires, and other events. And we're continuing our dialogue with GoBiz to advance the creation of the Sustainable Manufacturing Council. Next slide, please. We have just 2 more action areas here before we wrap up. First up is our education cradle to career action area, which is where we focus our education and workforce efforts in order to ensure that all Californians have access to high quality education and training programs that lead to good, well-paid jobs. Building on the work at the 2019 summit, along with several other organizations, we formed the California Cradle to Career Coalition, which consists of California Promise neighborhoods and C2C organizations from around the state. The coalition is seeking funding for a statewide grant program to support C2C infrastructure, which seeks to disrupt the cycle of poverty by providing comprehensive services to children, parents, and their communities. We are co-sponsoring legislation authored by Assemblymember Levine to this effect, and are also using this coalition as a deliberative body to think through ways to address education issues related to the pandemic, such as recovery from learning loss. In addition to the comprehensive approach of the C2C group, we're building on our legacy of regional workforce development initiatives with California's community college system through our Providing Meaningful Career Pathways work group. The group developed a prototype for successful employer engagement as a means to overcoming barriers that students, particularly community college students, face in securing work-based learning opportunities as part of their education and training programs. We'll be publishing that prototype here in the next few weeks to source additional feedback and further implementation efforts. Next slide, please. And that brings us to our final action area, Connecting California. Informed by our broadband access and increasing community investment work groups, Connecting California focuses on strengthening the infrastructure that connects us and serves as a basis for economic development. Our priority actions include supporting the continued development and implementation of the state's broadband action plan and supportive legislation to close the digital divide. As part of this webinar series, we'll also be showcasing innovative deployment models. And finally, our last priority action is continuing to support the efforts of our increasing community investment group as they seek to strengthen the enhanced infrastructure financing district tool to facilitate broader regional state participation, among other enhancements. So that is a wrap on our priority actions for 2021. I will toss it back to Micah, and we're excited to work with all of you as we advance this work to move California forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Ish. Thanks, Patrick. And we have a great question in the chat, which I'll read, but it boils down to, what the heck is a region, right? What do you mean when you say regions? So Heath Carney asks, how do your regions correspond to bioregions, most relevant for natural resources, which do not necessarily agree with government-defined regions such as counties? I'll throw something in, and then if anybody else wants to add. So the short answer is, we don't have set regions, right? Regions are areas where people have common interests, and those common interests might be a commute shed, where people are trying to figure out how folks get to jobs. Those common interests might be an air basin or a watershed, as came up in the question. And so we organize folks as appropriate around the areas with which they share common interests. So later this afternoon, we're going to be working with our stakeholders in the northern San Joaquin Valley, so the counties of San Joaquin, Stanislaus, and Merced. And from an air basin perspective and many other perspectives, they share a lot of common interests with folks in the entire Central Valley. But from an economic perspective and a commute shed perspective, the counties in the northern San Joaquin Valley actually are much more connected to the Bay Area, much more connected to the Sacramento area. So you saw the map that Ish put up, and it doesn't have regional lines because regions change. And so that's a big part of what we try to do, is anchor it in people's actual experiences versus anchoring it in lines on a map, because lines on a map are not human experience. So we are all about people's life sheds rather than the jurisdictional boundaries they happen to live within. Any other thoughts on that from the team?
No, I think you captured it really well. The life shed piece is the takeaway there.
Right. So another question is really around racial and economic equity, right? So we hear a tremendous amount about that these days, but there are challenges, as we saw from some of the data that Patrick Atwater presented, in actually getting better outcomes for race equity in the state? Not just talking about it, not just taking symbolic actions, but how, through across all the work that we do, how does, race equity really feature very significantly in the economic development efforts? How are these economic development efforts different than the conventional economic development efforts that have gotten us the conventional outcome? So maybe Ish, I could start with you. Could you tell us a little bit more from your experience with the Fresno Drive, from your experience in the Salinas Valley? How is this type of economic development really centering race and economic equity?
Yeah, sure thing. So, what we're observing and seeing emerge in many of the regions that have embarked on this journey is that there's more time and effort being given to ensuring that the voices of organizations, of groups who represent residents, business, the nonprofit sector, the government sector, the more of those non-traditional voices are at the table when developing, when thinking about brainstorming from the very beginning, and joining in the development in the cooking of the recipe, if you will, as opposed to just being served the meal. They're there contributing to the discussions, using empirical data to guide questions around how previous efforts have or have not worked for specific sectors of the community. And so that inclusivity piece is really, in my observations, has really been prioritized. And again, it's not just community groups, but it's also doing more to reach out to the employers as well. The other piece of it is that many of these regions have really embraced the need, in my opinion, to discuss historic racial class struggles in their respective regions. And these have been conversations that have not been easy to begin, but as one of our partners often reminds us during these very important sessions, is that it's important to get uncomfortable to get to a point of comfort. And I feel that there has been a lot of progress made in that space, in healing a lot of the wounds that have plagued many of our communities. And it's enabled more discussion and more common focus on the priority of developing a new strategy for making sure that economic growth is being enjoyed and taken advantage of by all, and not just a specific few. So that those two pieces, I think, have been very have been different. And then what we're seeing also emerge in some regions is the shift from what you referenced as conventional economic development to economic development practitioners really prioritizing community input to inform their activities as a traditional, in some cases, economic development corporation, and to the point where inclusive community scorecards are now being considered to assess the alignment of prospective employers and the jobs they bring with the values of the region and the community. And that, I think, is very transformational, has a lot of potential, and it's something that we're seeing emerge in regions. And so that excites me because I think it has the ability to be more responsive to the gaps that exist in who is benefiting from the prosperity and the growth and who is not.
Absolutely. It's about building those relationships at the outset and actually planning for the economy together. Sadly, the way that we do community engagement in the state generally, through like public comment for people complaining about plans that are basically already done, is totally garbage and useless and needs to be done away with, right? We need to be planning side by side, hand in hand with the authentic community organizations, centering their concerns, having an economic development agenda that works for the people living in the communities at the outset, rather than developing one and having a terrible 8-hour meeting in which people are complaining at the tail end of it.
Yeah, so, the other observation, really quick, is what I mentioned earlier in my comments about the characteristics of some of our new CSN members, our network, and that's these are intermediary organizations that are setting the table, the more expansive table for more stakeholders to engage in these processes. We're seeing, I'm observing that many community foundations have embraced the role as the trusted Switzerlands, if you will, of their regions, and are the ones that are taking the leadership in bringing folks together around these efforts. So that's been an interesting observation. And I should say that these efforts are not exclusive of some of the traditional stakeholders in the economic development space. You have your EDCs at the table, your workforce investment boards, your industry associations, your CBOs, and your institutional reps. But the people who are convening has been interesting to see them embrace these roles. So that's
and that's a big difference and challenge in what we do at California Forward, right? We want to make sure we're not just having conversations about race equity that are real among organizations focused organizationally on race equity. We've got to build those bridges. We've got to get the business community really changing its practices. It's great for the business community to have diversity and inclusion officers, to do charitable work in this area, but that's not ultimately the game. The game is having different outcomes, and so bringing people to the table, developing those relationships, developing a shared understanding of race equity and planning together. So just to answer a couple of quick questions in the chat from Marianne Haverhill, hello. Which community foundations have taken a leadership role? There are many. Certainly the Central Valley Community Foundation under Ashley Swearingen's leadership, who is the incoming co-chair of California Forward, has been really great in this regard. The Monterey Community Foundation has been very involved in the Salinas Valley. The Inland Empire Community Foundation under the leadership of Michelle Decker has been great, but all up and down the state, a lot of these community foundations have leaned in and been real leaders in how do we develop an economy that works for everyone. Another quick question. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add, we have folks in Kern County, the Kern Community Foundation with Kristen Bill Watson and Marianne Cannon in Stanislaus County. I've also stepped into leadership roles. We just this week had interest from the Ventura County Community Foundation also expressing their desire to become involved in potentially something similar in their region. So it's
a big movement, which we're happy to help facilitate. And just to answer a quick question from Billy Greer, and then I'm going to toss the question about how we coordinate with other people to you, Jennifer. But the Los Angeles region is absolutely in our scope. Two of the folks on the call today are actually in the Los Angeles region. And we work very closely with lots of different organizations there through the Economic Summit, but the two members of our California Stewardship Network from Los Angeles currently are the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation and Unite LA. But really interested, not just in Los Angeles City, the San Fernando Valley, the San Gabriel Valley, Sella, other parts of Los Angeles really have to are a big part of what we care about and focus on at California Forward. But maybe, Jennifer, you could talk a little bit more. How do we, so what's a working group, right? How do we actually get these different groups involved, whether it's the state agencies like the Natural Resources Agency or community colleges? How do we bring people together for collective action through the summit?
Yeah, it's a great question. So where we start, first of all, is does this fit within the action areas that California Forward has identified as a place where we think it's important to move these issues forward, and we think that we can make a real difference. We can be a real value add. because we know there's a lot of different organizations in the state and a lot of different players. And so we really think critically about where we can make a significant impact through our coalition building. And so once we've identified an issue, we work with all kinds of different entities, like I mentioned in the presentation, the roadmap, from our leadership council to our summit advisory committee, the CSN, and we get a sense of who is interested in moving this work forward and who we can partner with. We really look for internal advocates, people who are on the ground and working on these issues day in and day out, and who are passionate about bringing these changes forward. And it's consensus building, it's coalition building, it's a lot of talking with people and seeing where these different puzzle pieces fit together. And it's a deliberative, fun process where by the time that we come to these priorities that the work group have developed, it's really been vetted by people up and down the state from a bunch of different sectors, a lot of cross-sector partnerships. And so it's a process where a lot of different people's voices are heard, and we're really proud of how we've managed that through the work group. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add here, Micah. But
yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things, that you said is we're not trying to boil the ocean. We're not actually trying to do everything. Sometimes people look at our agenda and they say, where's this, that, and the other thing, right? We really look at what are the other networks effectively addressing and what are they not addressing. So a good example is Tia Boatman-Patterson from Cal HFA, the state agency, is among the leaders that came to us and said, look, home ownership just isn't on the agenda, and it needs to be. It's not being effectively addressed within the state. And so she, as an agency lead, came together with other folks throughout the state in coalition to really put home ownership back on the agenda for, I mean, a number of purposes, but also because home ownership is the vehicle for middle-class wealth creation that communities of color have been shut out of. So we're going to be continuing to do a lot of work with groups like John Gamboa at the 200, because we really believe that this is an area that the state needs to take much, much more seriously. But maybe I'll go with one more question and direct that to you, Patrick. We have a question around how often the DREAM Index is updated, and how, given that we just released the 2019 data, right? What is the 2020 data? As you said at the outset, Patrick, we're in a little bit of a plague year, right? What do we expect the 2020 data to show when we see those updates?
Yeah, so the California DREAM Index as a whole gets updated annually. We use a lot of the U.S. Census Bureau data, which has an annual cadence. 2020, it's a big question of what will it look like, because, one, there's all the COVID conundrums, and then two, there was a lot of issues with the Census Bureau in terms of the rollout there. I mean, I would expect, we're going to see a lot of the same trends that we saw throughout the decade, where, there was a lot of inequity continue. That would be kind of the broad anticipation. And then the other thing I would flag is that we also, definitely as part of the larger DREAM Index project, we link to a lot of the resources that have higher frequency updates. So things like the data I was showing around the unemployment rate for higher wage and lower wage jobs, that comes from Professor Raj Chetty at Harvard's Opportunity Insights, which is the empirical foundation for a lot of this work. And they have a really nifty tool around that we kind of included as part of the larger umbrella of the DREAM Index project.
Yeah, I mean, and I think like a big question is, what's going to be a blip and what's going to be a trend? And, what is really going to have been true in 2020, but what is going to persist across the years? And unfortunately, a lot of what we know about the people's success in their life course lets us know that sort of catastrophic economic effects can resonate not only over the course of their lives, but over the course of generations. So that's why it is so important to get this equitable economies work done right. And so we're going to be talking about that an awful lot more as we go forward, and making connections across different areas. So we have a question from Courtney Riley. How do you make these connections across priority groups? Thank you so much, Courtney, for being engaged in Cradle to Career. But obviously that's connected to economic growth, workforce, and a number of other issues. So Jennifer, do you just want to say a little bit about how we make connections across the working groups?
Yeah, sure. It's something that we are trying to be very deliberative about. We know that there's policy, these action areas do not exist in a vacuum, and everything is interconnected and touches on some aspect of another issue that we care about. So really, we just try and make sure that we're bringing everyone into the same rooms and having the same conversations as often as possible. And we're not operating in silos. It's a constant work in progress. It's something that we are aiming to always get better at, but it's just trying to get as often as possible people talking and having the same conversations and not being siloed.
Awesome. Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, so since we're the only thing standing between you and walking into the adjacent room in your house and having lunch, we'll wrap up on time. I really want to thank everybody for participating. I want to thank my wonderful colleagues, Jennifer, Patrick, and Ish, the whole rest of the team at California Forward, our leadership council, our partners in the California Stewardship Network and in the Economic Summit, everybody who's involved in this movement. So for those of you who are like, sounded kind of interesting, maybe different than what I'm normally involved in, maybe a little bit more hopeful than what I'm normally involved in. A lot of people are looking at the agenda in the legislature this year. Some of it's very good, some of it's very exciting. On housing, for example, it doesn't really seem like we're going to break the logjam this year. So what's a different approach? How can I engage with the people in my communities? How can I really have more hope about getting better outcomes that we see in the California Dream Index? Well, join us to learn more about the roadmap priorities, the California Economic Summit. Reach out to Jennifer to learn more about the California Stewardship Network, our leadership development programs, and that whole regional movement. Reach out to Ish, who I have to vouch is actually a totally fun, cool guy, as he said, even though his professional picture is very serious. And to join the California Dream Index community of practice, reach out to Patrick. You can support our work at californiaforward.org/donate. And then the best way to learn about all the next webinars in this series, all the work that we do, all the work that our partners do, is through signing up for our newsletter, because everybody definitely needs another newsletter in their inbox. But seriously, this is an amazing one. Our colleagues John Gunther and Hanya Palacios are among the folks that lead the development of that. It's a really great source of information about California and what's really going on in California, below the partisan talking points, below the political struggle, below everything that you're normally seeing on Twitter all day. It's really some great substantive information about building an equitable economy. So let me close with that. We've got a big task ahead of us, folks. We do not want an economic recovery, because if we have an economic recovery, we're going to recover the wide racial inequities that we see in the state of California, the geographic inequities between the Central Valley and the Bay Area, the economic inequities of people that are struggling, lower income people of all races and ethnicities that are falling further and further behind in California. So this is an effort. It takes all sectors, it takes all people, it takes all regions. Thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you next Thursday at 11. Thanks, folks.